I have charity for my people, and great faith in Christ, that I shall meet many souls spotless at his judgment seat. All ye ends of the earth, hearken unto these words, and believe in Christ, for they are the words of Christ. And he
I want to take a moment here and talk about the small plates, specifically those who wrote the small plates. The recorders, Nephi, Jacob, Jerem, Enos, Jerem, Omni, all the way down to the end. Let us look at their ages specifically. What can we learn about this? How can we calculate it? Now we have here, of course, in the beginning of Jacob, chapter 1, verse 1, we are told that it is in the 55th year since they left Jerusalem, which means this is just about the time that Nephi died. Now I calculate Nephi was 16 when they left Jerusalem, so this means he is 71 at his death. But the next date listed is not until we get to Enos. Enos, chapter 1, verse 25, 179 years later. And this is the end of Enos' record. So from the death of Nephi to the end of Enos' record is 124 years. How do we know, how do we take this information and calculate how old Jacob was and how old Enos was? Well, we know that Jacob was born during those 8 years in the wilderness before they crossed the sea. So the latest that Jacob could be born is 7 years after they leave Jerusalem. Now, if we take that date, 7 to 179, we have 172 years from the birth of Jacob to the death of Enos. And there has to be some kind of overlap in there. Jacob still had to be alive when Enos was born, because he gives the record to Enos. Matter of fact, he had to be alive when Enos was old enough to get the record. Now, if we take just a common date, say he was 25 years old when Enos was born, well, 72 minus 25, Enos would be 147 at his death. That doesn't really make sense, not for this time period. So we just have to keep adding on years and seeing what result we get. And we get to the end, we get Enos lived to be about 110 years old. And this means he's born when Jacob is in his mid to late 60s. Jacob himself likely lived to be about 98 years old. As I've mentioned before, he probably died around the turn of the century, around 100 years after they leave Jerusalem. This means that Enos kept the record for 80 more years. He was about 30 years old when Jacob died, and he kept the record for 8 years. He lived to be 110. Now the next date we get here is Jerem. He actually mentions two dates. One at the beginning of his record, Jerem chapter 1, verse 5, 200 years have passed away. So he's starting his record about 21 years after Enos has died. But then he mentions in verse 13, 238 years. So we assume that Jerem died around 238 years after they left Jerusalem. This means he would have kept the record for approximately 58 years. So how old was Enos when Jerem was born? Well, again, Enos lived to be 110. And we've got to add another 58 years after that. Let us say, again, just like with Jacob, that Enos was in his 60s. This gives us, for Jerem, an estimated age of 106 years, because if Enos was in his 60s, say 65, then it would have been 45 years before he died. Jerem would have been 45 years old when Enos gave him the records. 45 plus 58, well, that gives us 103. After Jerem, we turn to Omni. And Omni is written by 5 different men. First, we have Omni himself, and he states in verse 3, 276 years, but then 282 years, and he ends his record. He gives us these 2 dates in one verse. So 282, this means he kept the record after Jerem 44 years. Now, if we again estimate him being born when Jerem's in his 60s, we get an estimated age for Omni of 90 years. Omni then gives it to his son Ammoron, who then gives it to his brother Chemish. Now Ammoron, he gives us a date of 320 years. This is in verse 5, which means he kept the record for about 40 years. And then he gives it to his brother Chemish. Now again, using the same thing, estimating that they were born when their father was in his 60s. The youngest, though, Chemish was most likely the youngest. He was born when Omni in his 60s. Therefore, Ammoron likely born when Omni was in his 50s. So we have estimated ages, both of them living to 90, Ammoron and Chemish. Now Chemish gives it to his son Abinadab, and he gives it to Amaleki, again following this same pattern of being born when their father was in his 60s. We have estimated ages for Abinadab at 97 and Amaleki at 87. each of them keeping the record for 57 years. Now, Malachi says he gives the records to King Benjamin, but he says he is born in the time of Mosiah, King Mosiah the first. So this gives us a way to estimate King Benjamin's age. Without going into too much detail in this video, I estimate King Benjamin to have died when he was 97. He turns the kingdom over to his son Mosiah II when he is 94. Now Mosiah is, I think, 30 years old when he takes the throne, so he was also born when Benjamin was in his 60s. Following the same basic pattern, we see these men during the small plates lived an extraordinarily long time. In order for this timeline to work, they had to have lived for an extraordinarily long time. All of them. And I can bring up this table here, this full table. This is all my calculations. We have the recorders: Nephi, Jacob, Enos, Jerem, Omni, Amram, Chemish, Benadam, and Malachi. They're the recorders of the small plates. This tells us what books they contributed to, what they actually wrote down. This is how many years after they leave Jerusalem that they finished their record, when they have a date mentioned. We estimate how old they were, what years they lived in the BC calendar, and how many years they kept the record. Now, one final note here, what this tells us, something very interesting, is that these men, when they passed on the records, they weren't giving it to their oldest son. Their oldest son would have been born when they were in their 20s, maybe 30s. They're giving it to their youngest son. In order for this to work, this has to be their youngest son. And I think the reason for this is twofold. First of all, it keeps the record more pure. The fewer people keeping the record, the less chance of it being contaminated. But at the same time, you have each person keeps the record for as long as possible. I mean, look at this. Nephi, 55 years. Jacob, about 45. Enos, around 80. Jerem, 58 years. Omni, 44 years. Amram, 40. Chemish, 20. Abinadab and Amalekite, each 57 years. They each held the record for a long period of time. And because of this, they could preserve it more easily. The more people you change hands, not just preserving its integrity and its purity, but they ensured that it didn't get lost. The more people, the more hands it changes, the more likely you have for contamination, but also for loss. They wanted to make sure these records were preserved, and this was the best way to do it. Give it to the youngest son. That way, the fewest possible people handle it, and you can preserve the record. Now, this is just my thoughts. This is my calculations. These are not stated by any prophets. This is just what I think happened. And with this in mind,
and now
let us now finish out the small plates.
All those who are of the house of Israel, and all ye ends of the earth, I speak unto you as the voice of one crying from the dust. Farewell, until that great day shall come.